The leather saddlebag had been sitting on Naomi Graves's kitchen table for 3 days before she finally worked up the nerve to open it. It was the kind of late October afternoon in 1882 that made the New Mexico territory feel like the end of the earth. The sky bruised purple and orange over the mesa, the wind carrying the smell of distant rain and dry sage, the kind of cold that crept under your collar and settled in your bones. Naomi stood at the window of her small adobe house on the outskirts of Clover Creek, watching the last of the daylight drain away, and she kept glancing back at the bag like it might disappear if she looked away too long. Harlan Bailey had ridden out 7 weeks ago. He had left without saying goodbye, without a note nailed to her door, without a single word of explanation to anyone in town. One morning his horse was gone from the stable at the edge of Clover Creek. His room above the feed store was empty, and the only thing left behind was this battered brown saddlebag that old Cecil Marsh had found hanging from Naomi's fence post before dawn. Cecil had brought it to her door that same morning, holding it out with both hands like it was something sacred or something dangerous, and he had said, "I reckon this belongs to you, Miss Naomi." Or at least, I reckon he meant it too. She had thanked Cecil quietly and set the bag on the table, and there it had stayed. Part of her was afraid that opening it would make real the thing she had been refusing to feel for 7 weeks. If she opened it and found nothing of consequence, a spare shirt, a tin of tobacco, maybe a few coins, then Harlan Bailey would be reduced to a careless man who had left clutter behind, and she would be a fool for standing at her window every evening watching the road that came in from the south. But if she opened it and found something else, something that meant what she was beginning to suspect it might mean, then she would have to face the full weight of what had happened between them. Or rather, what had almost happened, what had been quietly building for the better part of a year without either of them having the courage to name it. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot she kept warm on the iron stove, sat down at the table, and pulled the saddlebag toward her. The buckle was stiff from weather and use. She worked it open slowly, and the smell that rose from inside was distinctly Harlan leather and cedar and something smoky and warm, like the inside of a general store on a winter morning. She reached in and her fingers found not a shirt, not tobacco, not coins. They found paper. Folded sheets of it, dozens of them, some thick and cream-colored where he had used proper letter paper, some thin and rough where he had used whatever was at hand, the backs of receipt slips, the margins torn from almanac pages, the inside panels of an old envelope that had been flattened and written upon so densely the ink nearly bled through. They were bound together loosely with a length of brown twine, and when she lifted them out and set them on the table, they made a stack almost 2 inches thick. Her hands were not quite steady when she untied the twine. The first letter was dated November 14, 1881, almost exactly 1 year ago. She recognized his handwriting immediately, though she had only seen it a handful of times on the ledgers he kept for the ranch he worked outside of town, on a note he had once left at the mercantile asking her to hold back a bolt of blue calico because he thought the color would suit her. His handwriting was precise and a little stiff, like a man who had learned letters later in life and was still slightly formal about it, but it was also somehow warm if handwriting could be warm, each letter formed with a kind of care that made you feel the hand behind it. She read the first line and stopped breathing. "Dear Naomi," it said, "I saw you in the churchyard this morning pulling those stubborn little weeds from around your mother's marker, and I thought about stopping to speak with you, but I did not. And now I am sitting in my room at the feed store trying to understand why a man with perfectly adequate command of the English language completely loses it when standing inside 20 feet of one woman in the whole of New Mexico territory." Naomi set the letter down on the table. She pressed her hands flat against the wood and stared at the ceiling, and she made a sound that was half a laugh and half something else entirely, something that started in her chest and moved upward in a way that threatened to become crying. Then she picked the letter back up and kept reading. I have been in Clover Creek for 8 months now, Harlan had written, and I believe I have spoken to you a total of 11 times by my count, not including nods of greeting on the street, which I do not count because they require no particular bravery. The 11 times I actually formed words in your presence, I managed to say mostly sensible things, though the conversation we had in April about the flooding on the South Pasture was, I think, the single most boring exchange I have ever participated in, and I am ashamed of it. You talked about the cattle and I talked about the creek banks, and all the while I was thinking that your hair had come loose on the left side, and there was a strand of it lying across your cheek, and it was the most distracting thing I had ever seen in my life. I did not mention this. I talked about creek banks for 11 minutes. I counted. She laughed out loud at that, alone in her kitchen in the dark, and the sound surprised her. She turned up the oil lamp on the table and settled more deeply into her chair. She read every letter that night. Naomi Graves had come to Clover Creek in 1879 at the age of 23, following her father after her mother's death back in Tennessee. Her father, Robert Graves, had been a surveyor, a quiet and methodical man who had contracted with the territorial government to map portions of the region. And he had brought Naomi with him because she was the only family he had left, and because she was, as he often said, the most practical woman he had ever known, which was the highest compliment Robert Graves was capable of paying. They had made their life in Clover Creek, and Naomi had taken over the running of the household with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything. And when her father had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1881, she had simply continued. She had the house. She had a small plot of land. She took in laundry and mending and sometimes sat with sick neighbors, and she was respected in Clover Creek, though she was not sure she was particularly well known, because she was the kind of woman who was very good at being present without making herself the center of attention. She had noticed Harlan Bailey the way you notice something that keeps appearing at the edge of your vision, gradually, and then all at once. He had come to town in the spring of 1881, hired on as a ranch hand at the Dunsmore operation 5 miles south, and she had seen him first at the Mercantile, buying a pair of work gloves, arguing mildly with old Mr. Petty about the price. He was tall and lean with dark hair going slightly gray at the temples. He was 29, she would learn later, only 6 years older than her, and he had a face that was weathered and honest, the kind of face that had spent a great deal of time outdoors and did not apologize for it. He was not flashy in the way some of the ranch hands were, not loud or boisterous, and he did not seem to require an audience. He paid for his gloves, tipped his hat to Mr. Petty, and walked out, and Naomi had watched him go and thought, in a very quiet and controlled way, that he was probably the most handsome man she had ever seen up close. Then she had gone home and been perfectly sensible about it. But she had kept noticing him. At church on Sundays, 3 pews back on the left. At the Mercantile when she picked up her weekly supplies. At the livery stable once when her mare had thrown a shoe and he had been there with his own horse, a big gray gelding named Cole, and he had helped without being asked, just walked over and held the mare's halter while old Sam the farrier worked, and afterward he had said, "She is a good horse." Steady eyes, and Naomi had said, "Yes, she is." And that had been the entirety of that conversation, which she had found herself replaying several times in subsequent days. Now she sat in her kitchen in the autumn of 1882 and read what Harlan Bailey had thought about all of it. He had written the letters over the course of a full year, November 1881 through October 1882. Some were short, only half a page, dashed off in a hurry or in the middle of the night. Others ran to 4 or 5 pages, dense with thought and observation, funny in places, heartbreaking in others. He wrote about the ranch and the work, about the particular quality of light over the mesa in January, about a foal born in the middle of a February blizzard that he had helped into the world by lantern light with frozen fingers. He wrote about books he had managed to get hold of from the small lending collection at the Reverend's house. He wrote about his past, which he touched on carefully, the way you touch something that has been broken and mended, a boyhood in Texas, a father who drank too much and worked too little, a younger brother named Thomas who had died of fever at the age of 9, which Harlan described in a single stark paragraph that made Naomi press her hand to her mouth. And woven through all of it, constant as a thread through cloth, was Naomi. He wrote about seeing her at the dry goods store in February, wearing a gray wool coat and haggling cheerfully with Mr. Petty over the price of flour, and how she had won the argument through sheer pleasantness, smiling until the man reduced the price out of pure goodwill. "I think," Harlan had written, "that you could talk a stone wall into reconsidering its position." He wrote about hearing her laugh at the church social in March. A real laugh, not the polite one you give to things that are only moderately funny, but the one that comes up unexpectedly. And I thought a man could build a whole life around that sound if he were lucky enough to earn it. He wrote about watching her from a careful distance as she planted her kitchen garden in April, working in the morning light with methodical efficiency, and how he had wanted very badly to come and help, but had not wanted to be presumptuous. He wrote about the afternoon in June when she had brought food to the Calloway family after their barn burned, how she had organized half the town into helping without making anyone feel managed, and he had written, "You are the most capable person I have ever known, and the strange thing is that you do not seem to know it, or if you know it, you wear it lightly, like something that does not need to be announced." In July, his tone shifted. "I am going to stop writing these letters," he had written on the 4th of that month. "Not because I have stopped thinking what I have been thinking, but because a man who spends a year writing letters he never sends is either a coward or a fool, and I am not sure which is worse. I am going to walk up to your door and knock on it and say something real. I have decided." Then there was a letter dated July 8th. "I did not knock on your door. I got as far as the gate, and then the Henderson boy came riding through town hollering about a wagon accident on the North Road, and everyone ran to help. And by the time the situation was sorted out it was dark, and I went back to my room, and here I am." Naomi laughed again, and this time the laughter came with tears. In August, something had changed. She could feel it in the letters, a new tension in his writing, a kind of urgency underneath the careful sentences. He had begun to write not just about watching her from a distance, but about genuinely reckoning with himself. "I know what I am afraid of," he had written in mid-August. "I am afraid you will be kind about it. You are a kind woman, Naomi Graves, and I know exactly how kindly a woman like you would decline a man like me, and I think I would rather wonder forever than know for certain." Then, September. "I spoke to Reverend Alcott today about, well, I did not say specifically, but I said something general about a man wondering whether he ought to speak his mind when the stakes are considerable, and the Reverend said that silence was only ever a mercy to the man who kept it, never to the one it was kept from. I have been thinking about that." And then October, 3 letters written in the first 2 weeks of the month, increasingly raw, increasingly close to something. The last one was dated October 9th, 11 days before he had ridden out of Clover Creek. "Dear Naomi," the last letter read, "I have been writing to you for a year. I have filled more paper than I care to count with things I want to say to you, and I have not said any of them, and I think you deserve better than a man who can only be honest in letters he seals up and never delivers. I think you deserve someone who can look at you and say what is true. The truth is this: I am in love with you. I have been in love with you since February, or possibly since November, or possibly since the first morning I saw you walking across the churchyard and thought, there is a woman who knows exactly who she is, and I wanted desperately to be someone worth knowing in return. I do not know if I am that man. I have tried to become one. I will keep trying, whether or not you ever know I am trying, because you have made me want to be better simply by existing. But I cannot stay in Clover Creek any longer without saying this to your face, and I cannot bring myself to say it to your face without knowing that I am worthy of it, and so I am leaving because I am still apparently, a coward. I am sorry for that. If you ever read this, and you won't, because I will never send it, know that I am sorry for that most of all. Naomi folded the last letter and set it on top of the stack and sat very still for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the sage and the night was deep and cold and quiet. And in her small kitchen with the oil lamp burning warm and the stack of letters in front of her, Naomi Graves understood two things with the absolute clarity that sometimes comes only in the smallest hours of the night. The first was that she had been in love with Harlan Bailey for the better part of a year without admitting it to herself, and reading his letters had not created that feeling so much as revealed it, the way you might pull back a curtain and find the light had been there all along. The second was that she was not going to sit in her kitchen and be sensible about it. She was going to find him. She went to bed with this decision made and woke the next morning with it still firmly in place, which she took as a good sign, because sometimes decisions made at midnight dissolved in daylight, but this one did not. She dressed in her warmest clothes, fed her mare, and rode into town to see what she could learn. What she learned from Cecil Marsh, who functioned as Clover Creek's unofficial clearinghouse for all information about everything, was that Harlan Bailey had ridden south and then east, toward the town of Redemption, which was 2 days' ride across country that was not particularly friendly in late October. Cecil told her this with a troubled expression and then said, "Now, Miss Naomi, you are not thinking of going after him yourself, I hope," in a tone that suggested he already knew the answer. "I am going to need provisions," she said, "and a map if you have one." Cecil did not have a map, but he had something better. He had his nephew, a young man of 22 named Gil Marsh, who had ridden that route twice and knew the terrain. Gil was enthusiastic about the adventure in a way that made Naomi feel simultaneously grateful and slightly alarmed, but he was a competent rider and had a steady temperament, and when she explained the situation to him, leaving out the personal details, he simply said, "Well, let's go get him," as though retrieving men who had ridden off into the desert was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday errand. They rode out the next morning at first light, Naomi with the saddlebag tied securely behind her saddle, because she was bringing it with her. She was not sure exactly what she was going to say to Harlan Bailey when she found him, but she knew she was going to say it with his letters present, because they deserved to be answered. The country between Clover Creek and Redemption was beautiful and indifferent, the kind of landscape that did not particularly care whether you made it through. Red rock and pale sand and the occasional stand of juniper, the sky so enormous overhead that it made you aware of your own smallness in a way that was either humbling or terrifying depending on your mood. Naomi found it humbling. She had always liked big sky. It reminded her of the feeling she sometimes got reading a very good book, of being simultaneously very small and part of something very large. Gil was good company in the uncomplicated way of young men who are genuinely helpful without requiring much maintenance. He pointed out landmarks, kept a sensible pace, and had the good sense to not ask too many questions about what exactly had driven a respectable woman from Clover Creek to ride 2 days across New Mexico territory in late October. Naomi appreciated this. They camped the first night in the shelter of a red rock formation that blocked the worst of the wind, and Naomi sat by the small fire and thought about the letters. She had brought the last one in her coat pocket, and she read it again by firelight, the paper warm between her fingers, Harlan's careful handwriting sharp and intimate in the dancing light. "I am still, apparently, a coward," he had written, and she thought about the fact that a coward was generally defined as someone who fled from difficult things, but that a man who spent a year writing down the most honest contents of his heart, even to pages he thought no one would ever read, was not precisely what she would call a coward. Brave in the dark and frightened in the light, she understood that. She had done it herself in different ways. They reached Redemption by midday on the second day. Redemption was a frontier town that had been built up quickly around a silver mine that was now mostly played out, and it had the slightly deflated look of a place whose moment of prosperity was behind it. A long main street of weathered wooden buildings, a hotel with a crooked sign, a saloon that appeared to be doing the most consistent business in town. Naomi and Gil rode in and got looks, because a woman riding in with a saddlebag and a purposeful expression always got looks in a town like Redemption in 1882. She went to the hotel first and asked about Harlan Bailey, describing him with the precision that comes from having observed someone carefully for a year. The clerk, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers, said yes. A man matching that description had taken a room 4 days ago. He was still here. Naomi felt something shift in her chest, relief and nervousness arriving simultaneously. She asked for his room number. The clerk said he had seen Mr. Bailey head toward the livery stable about an hour ago. Naomi thanked him, straightened her coat, and walked out. She found him at the livery stable, as the clerk had said. He was brushing down coal, his big gray gelding, moving with the easy attention of someone who found peace in physical work, his back to the door. He had not heard her come in. The stable smelled of hay and horses and the particular dusty warmth of animals in an enclosed space, and the light coming through the slats in the walls was that particular slanted quality of a midday sun at the end of October, gold and a little thin. She said his name. He turned around with the kind of controlled swiftness that you see in men who have spent time in places where you needed to know what was behind you. But when he saw her, the controlled part of it dissolved completely. He stood with the brush in his hand and stared at her, and the expression on his face moved through several things very quickly: shock, confusion, and then something that opened up in his eyes like a window being thrown wide. "Naomi," he said, just her name. The way he said it was not casual. "I found the saddlebag," she said. Something passed over his face then, a flash of something painful, and he looked down briefly and then back up at her, and he said, "I see. You left it on my fence post." "I did not mean to leave it on your fence post," he said, and there was a tightness in his voice now. "I meant to take it with me. I stopped at the fence because I do not know why I stopped. I had it in my hand and then I left it there. That was not planned." "I think some part of you planned it," Naomi said. He was quiet for a moment. The horse shifted gently beside him and he put one hand on Cole's neck without looking, automatic and steady, the way you touch something familiar. His eyes stayed on Naomi's face. "I read them," she said. "All of them, every single letter." She watched him absorb that. She could see it move through him, the exposure of it, a year of his most private thoughts laid bare. His jaw tightened slightly and then released. "Then you know," he said carefully, "that they were not written to be read." "And yet here I am," she said. She reached into the saddlebag she was carrying and pulled out the stack of letters, still bound with his brown twine, and held them out toward him. "Harlan Bailey, you spent a year telling me the most honest things I have ever heard, and you told them to paper because you were afraid, and then you rode away because you were afraid, and I rode 2 days across this territory in October to tell you that the honest thing you ought to have done was knock on my door." He stared at the letters and then at her. "Naomi, I am not finished," she said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was. "You wrote in that last letter that you did not know if you were worthy of it. I want to tell you that you are asking the wrong question. The question is not whether you are worthy. The question is whether you are willing. Worthiness is something we work out together over time in the ordinary days of a life. But first you have to be willing to stay." The stable was very quiet. Outside, the sounds of redemption went on, a horse somewhere, voices at a distance, the eternal wind. In here, it was just the two of them and the patient gray horse and a year of unsent letters between them. Harlan Bailey set down the brush. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides, and when he took her face in his hands were not entirely steady, which was somehow the most reassuring thing about all of it, that this large and careful and self-possessed man could be made unsteady by the same thing that had been making her unsteady for the better part of a year. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, the way she had imagined a person looking when there was nothing left to hide. "I am sorry," he said. "I am sorry I rode away instead of knocking on your door. I am sorry it took me a year of letters to work up to saying what I should have said to your face." "You can say it now," she said. "I love you," he said, and the plainness of it, after all the pages and all the months and all the careful distance, was extraordinary. "I have loved you for a very long time, and I would very much like to stop being afraid of it if you will let me try." "Yes," she said simply. Then he kissed her, there in the livery stable of Redemption, New Mexico Territory, in October of 1882, with the letters in her hand and his hands warm on her face, and the gray horse watching with the tolerant disinterest of an animal that has seen people behave strangely in his presence before. She would later think that there was something right about the location. A livery stable was a practical place, working leather and hay and horses, and the love that she and Harlan Bailey were working out was going to be a practical love, the kind built from ordinary days and honest words, not from grand gestures. It was right that it should begin somewhere real. They rode back to Clover Creek 3 days later. The 3 days in between were the most significant 3 days of Naomi's life up to that point, and she would carry them intact for the rest of it. They had walked around Redemption in the afternoon of the first day, and Harlan had held her hand with a careful deliberateness, like someone who was choosing to hold a thing rather than simply finding it in his grip. And they had talked, really talked, in the way that people who have been circling each other for a year can suddenly talk when the circling stops. She told him about Tennessee and her mother, and what it was like to come west at 23 with her father, and find that the territory, which she had imagined as frightening, was actually just enormous and mostly honest. He told her about Texas and the work he had done before Clover Creek, a string of ranch jobs across 3 states, always moving, always the new man, and how Clover Creek had felt different, had felt like a place he might actually want to stay. And then he looked at her when he said it, and she knew he was not talking about the town. He told her about Thomas, his little brother, and she did not offer platitudes because she had read the paragraph in the letter, and she understood that he did not need platitudes. She just listened, which he seemed to find sufficient, and afterward he said, "I have not talked about Thomas in about 6 years." And the way he said it made her understand that silence had not been serving him particularly well. She told him about her father, about the way grief had made her more capable and more lonely simultaneously, how she had channeled everything into practicality because practicality was something she could control, and how there was a cost to that, a kind of thinness, a life well organized but perhaps not yet fully lived. He said, "I want to help with that if you will let me." She said, "I believe that is rather the idea." Gil Marsh, who was staying at the hotel on the other side of town, materialized only for meals and then dissolved graciously back into his own business, which Naomi appreciated enormously. Young Gil had the social intelligence to understand that he was peripheral to whatever was happening, and he honored that with admirable tact. On the 3rd morning, Harlan said, "I would like to come back to Clover Creek with you. I would like to talk to Reverend Alcott about something, if that is agreeable to you." She considered him over her coffee cup. "It is agreeable to me," she said. They rode back through country that was the same country they had each ridden through separately to arrive here, but it was different now, which was not the country's doing. Naomi rode beside Harlan and they talked, and were sometimes quiet in the way that people can be quiet together when quiet is no longer a defense. And once, crossing a dry creek bed in the early afternoon of the 2nd day back, he reached over without speaking and tucked a strand of her hair that had come loose behind her ear, and she thought of the letter he had written about exactly that gesture, the creek bank conversation in April, the strand of hair across her cheek. And she felt a fullness in her chest that had no particular word for it, but that she recognized as the opposite of loneliness. "I read the letter about the April flood conversation," she said. He groaned, which made her laugh. The creek bank conversation, I know, 11 minutes. You talked for exactly 11 minutes about drainage patterns. I was nervous. Drainage patterns felt safe. They are, she agreed. Very safe. Nothing romantic has ever been implied by drainage patterns. He looked at her sideways with something that was almost a smile and entirely a man who was allowing himself to be teased. I counted, he said again, confirming what he had written, and the fact that he owned it rather than defended it made her feel something generous and warm toward him. They arrived back in Clover Creek on a Saturday morning in late October, the town quiet in the particular way of small towns on mornings when most people have not yet committed to being awake. Naomi's house looked small and solid and familiar in the morning light. The kitchen garden she had planted in April brown and put to bed for winter, the fence with its peeling white paint, the window where the oil lamp had been burning when she read his letters. She dismounted at her gate and he dismounted beside her and held both horses while she unlocked the door. And then he tied the horses to the post and came inside because she held the door open for him, and the invitation in that was not subtle. She made coffee. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where the Saddlebag had waited 3 days for her to open it, and looked at the room with an expression she could not quite categorize: appreciation, maybe, or recognition, the look of someone seeing a place they had been curious about. "This is where you read them," he said, looking at the table. "All night," she confirmed. "I did not sleep until I finished." "And when you finished," he looked at her carefully. "I decided to ride to redemption," she said. Something in his face settled, the way something settles when a question it has been holding for a long time finally gets an answer. He nodded once slowly, like a man confirming something he had been hoping was true. They went to see Reverend Alcott the following Monday morning. The Reverend was a broad, sensible man of 50-something who had been in Clover Creek almost as long as the town itself, and who had, over the years, developed a talent for marrying people with a minimum of fuss and a maximum of sincerity. He received them in his study with coffee and a warm directness that Naomi found enormously comfortable. Harlan did the talking, which she appreciated, because it was his idea to come, and she did not want to lead the conversation. He sat with his hat in his hands and explained the situation with the economy of a man who had been choosing his words carefully for a very long time, and was now applying that skill to something that actually mattered, that he had been in Clover Creek for a year and a half, that he intended to stay, that he had been given a position of foreman at the Dunsmore Ranch, and had made a fair arrangement on a piece of land to the north of town that old Dunsmore was willing to part with, that he loved Naomi Graves and she had agreed to be loved by him, and that they would like to be married as soon as could be arranged in a way that was appropriate. Reverend Alcott listened to all of this with his hands folded and his steady gaze moving between them, and when Harlan finished, the Reverend looked at Naomi and said, "Miss Graves, is all of that accurate as you understand it?" "It is," she said, "with the addition that the land arrangement may require some discussion with old Dunsmore, who I believe will be more agreeable if you negotiate on a Tuesday when his back is not troubling him." Harlan looked at her with mild surprise and she said, "I know him. His back troubles him on Mondays. Tuesday he is more pleasant." The Reverend laughed, a genuine barrel-chested laugh. "I will see about scheduling a ceremony for the first Saturday in December," he said. "That gives us 5 weeks, which should be sufficient for the practical arrangements and not so long that anyone has an opportunity to talk themselves out of anything sensible." It was, as it turned out, entirely sufficient. The 5 weeks were busy in the way that good busy is busy, full of purpose, full of small pleasures. Harlan negotiated for the land on a Tuesday, as Naomi had suggested, and Dunsmore was indeed in an agreeable mood, and they came to an arrangement that satisfied both parties and gave Harlan a deed to 80 acres of decent land with a creek running through the north end, and a small existing structure that would need work but had good bones. Naomi went to look at it on a clear November morning, riding out with Harlan, and stood in front of the low adobe building in the thin winter sun and thought about what it could be with time and attention and the same quiet practicality she brought to everything. "It needs work," Harlan said, watching her face. "Most things worth having do," she said. He smiled at that, the full smile she had been watching from a distance for a year and a half and that now she got to see up close. And it was exactly as good up close as it had appeared from a distance, possibly better. During those weeks, Naomi also quietly witnessed something about Harlan that the letters had suggested but that she could now see in action, the way he was in a community. He was not a man who made a spectacle of himself, but he was consistently, habitually decent. He helped old Cecil Marsh when Cecil's plow broke in the late autumn ground, spending most of a Sunday afternoon on the repair without being asked. He brought wood to the widow Patterson without making a production of it. He dealt fairly with the Dunsmore Ranch hands and they spoke well of him, and in a working community, people speaking well of a man was worth more than any formal recommendation. She was proud of him. She discovered this with some surprise, as though pride was something she had not anticipated feeling, but it was there and it was real. They also argued once over the house. Not a terrible argument, but a real one. She had a vision for how the front room ought to be arranged, and he had a different vision, and they each held their positions with enough conviction to make the other one slightly terse for an afternoon. Then she had gone out to look at his proposed arrangement with genuine attention rather than automatic disagreement, and she had seen that it had a logic to it that she had not initially credited, and she had come back inside and said, "I think you might be right about the window light," with the slight difficulty that admitting it required, and he had said, "I think your idea for the shelving is better than mine," which cost him something too, and they had laughed about it. And the argument had resolved itself into something better than either position alone. She thought that was probably a good sign. The first Saturday in December, 1882, was clear and cold. The sky the particular deep blue that happens in New Mexico in winter when there is no weather moving through. The kind of sky that makes the world look sharply defined. Naomi wore her good dress, a deep wine-colored wool that had been her mother's, and that she had altered to fit herself. Wearing it felt like carrying her mother forward into the day, which was a comfort. She had done her hair herself, pinned up with the few good pins she owned, and the strand that always came loose on the left side came loose as she was walking into the church, and she left it, because she had read the letter in which Harlan had written about exactly that strand of hair, and she thought, in a private and slightly wicked way, that he could tuck it behind her ear himself. He was standing at the front of the church with Reverend Alcott, and when she walked in, he saw her immediately. She watched the expression on his face go through the same rapid sequence she had seen in the livery stable impact, then something slower and deeper settling into place. And when she reached him and stood beside him, he did, in fact, reach over and tuck the loose strand of hair behind her ear, very gently, with one finger, and she felt the touch run all the way down to her heels. "I planned that," she said quietly, and he understood immediately and laughed, low and warm, and the Reverend looked at them with the pleased expression of a man who knows when he is marrying people who are going to be all right. The ceremony was short and honest and enough. Gil Marsh was there, grinning with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who felt he had contributed to the outcome. Cecil Marsh was there, and the widow Patterson and Mr. and Mrs. Dunsmore, and a scattering of the other Clover Creek people who had come to mark the occasion. There was no great fanfare, which suited both of them. When the Reverend said the words, and Harlan said them back, and Naomi said them back, she meant every one of them with the focused sincerity she brought to things that actually mattered. Outside afterward, in the cold December sun, someone had brought a camera, a cumbersome and impressive piece of equipment that the town's new photographer, a young man from Santa Fe, had brought to Clover Creek just months before. He took a photograph of Naomi and Harlan standing in front of the church, Naomi in her wine-colored dress with the loose strand of hair that had come loose again, Harlan in his good dark coat with his hand at the small of her back, both of them squinting slightly in the winter light. Years later, that photograph would sit on the mantelpiece of the house they built, and their children would look at it and see their parents young and windswept and very slightly stunned by happiness, which was accurate. They moved into the adobe house on the 80 acres the following spring, once the winter had released enough for work to begin in earnest. The work of making a home out of a structure with good bones and years of neglect was substantial, and Naomi came at it with the same methodical energy she brought to everything, and Harlan worked beside her with a willingness that never felt like obligation. They replastered the walls and repaired the roof, and built new shutters for the windows, and Harlan put up the shelving in the front room in the arrangement she had originally proposed, and she put up his suggested arrangement for the furniture, and the room ended up being better than either of them had imagined alone. They planted a kitchen garden in April. It was bigger than the one she had kept behind her old house in town, because they had more land and Harlan had, as she had suspected, a natural competence with growing things. He knew about soil and water and which direction to set beds for the best sun, and she knew about what to plant and when, and together they put in a garden that by summer would be producing more than they could easily eat, which meant that the widow Patterson and Cecil Marsh and the Calloway family received regular deliveries of vegetables throughout the season. In the evenings, they sat on the porch they had built along the south side of the house and watched the light go off the mesa, which was one of the most spectacular natural events that Naomi had ever witnessed on a regular basis, and which never quite lost its power. Harlan would read, because he was a serious and consistent reader when he had access to books, and she would mend or sew or sometimes just sit with her coffee and watch the sky, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they were quiet, and the quiet was never the defensive distance she had lived behind for most of the years before Clover Creek. It was the quiet of people who are comfortable with each other's presence. She had not known exactly how much she had wanted that kind of quiet until she had it. She kept the letters. She had tied them back with the brown twine after reading them, and she kept them in the small cedar box where she kept her mother's few pieces of jewelry and her father's surveying notes, things that mattered to her in ways that were difficult to articulate. She did not read them often, but occasionally, in the early mornings before Harlan was awake, she would open the box and take one out at random and read it, and the experience was always the same, something warm moving through her chest, a kind of gratitude, not for the fact of being loved, though she was grateful for that too, but for the evidence of a man working through his own heart with patience and honesty across the span of a year, teaching himself to be braver. She told him about the box one evening on the porch, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "I am glad you kept them. I thought about asking you to give them back in the beginning or to burn them." "I would not have," she said. "I know," he said. "That is why I did not ask." He paused, looking out at the last of the sunset. "I have thought about writing you letters now," he said, "proper ones, letters you would actually receive." She looked at him. "Harlan, you live here." "I know," he said, and his mouth curved. "I thought I might leave them on the kitchen table." She laughed, and the sound of it went out across the evening air, and he watched her laugh with the expression she had read about in November of 1881, the one that a man could build a whole life around if he were lucky enough to earn it. He had earned it. She wanted to make sure he knew. She reached over and took his hand, the way she had been taking his hand since redemption, since the afternoon they had walked through that defeated little silver-mine town, and she had felt his fingers close around hers with that deliberate choice, and she said, "Write them if you want. I will read every one." He turned her hand over in both of his and looked at it for a moment, this quiet examination, and then he said, "You are the most significant thing that has ever happened to me, Naomi Bailey." She liked her name in his mouth. She would never entirely stop liking it. "That is an extremely good thing to be," she said, "because you are the most significant thing that has happened to me too. Possibly the most significant thing that will happen to anyone in Clover Creek for some time." "That seems like a high bar," he said. "We have set it," she said. He kissed her there on the porch in the last light, and the mesa went purple and gold behind them, and Cole the gray horse moved in the paddock they had built along the east side of the house, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote spoke briefly to the darkening sky, and it was, as ordinary evenings went, about as close to perfect as anything Naomi Graves had been able to imagine. The following year was one of building, in the practical and the interior sense both. The ranch they were making from Harlan's 80 acres and the Dunsmore foreman position was demanding work, the kind of work that is satisfying in proportion to its difficulty. Harlan had a genuine understanding of cattle and land, and Naomi had a head for the business side that surprised him at first, and then did not surprise him at all, because he had written a letter in December of 1881 about her argument with Mr. Petty over the price of flour, and he had understood from that early on that she had a precise and practical mind for numbers and negotiation. Together they made a ranch that began to feel, by the end of 1883, like something real, not prosperous in any large-scale way, but solid, sustainable, a thing with a future. There were difficulties. There was a drought that summer that dried the creek to a trickle and killed a quarter of their pasture grass, and required Harlan to ride 3 days south to buy supplemental feed at a price that was not comfortable. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher, a man named Cobb, about the south fence line, which consumed 2 months of low-grade irritation, and eventually required Reverend Alcott to come out and mediate, which he did with patient authority, and the fence line was settled in a way that gave neither Harlan nor Cobb everything they wanted, which probably meant it was fair. There was an illness in January of 1884 that took Harlan down for 2 weeks with something that started as a bad chill and became a fever that frightened Naomi more than she had been frightened by anything since her father's pneumonia. She nursed him with single-minded efficiency, keeping the fire built up, making broth, sitting up through the worst nights with her hand on his forehead monitoring the temperature of him. And when the fever broke on the 10th day and he looked at her from the pillow with clear eyes and said, "You did not leave," she said. "Of course I did not leave, I am your wife," with a sharpness in her voice that was not anger but was what anger sounds like when it is covering fear. And he reached up and put his hand on her face and said, I know you did not," and that was all that needed to be said. She was pregnant by that spring. She had suspected it for several weeks before she told Harlan, not because she was uncertain of how he would receive the news, but because she was a woman who liked to be sure of things before she said them. When she was sure, she told him in the evening, on the porch where they had established the habit of their most important conversations, and his face did that thing it did when something moved through him faster than he could manage, the impact, the settling, the opening up, and then he put his arms around her and held her in a way that was not the embrace of the beginning of their relationship, tentative and carefully controlled, but the embrace of a man who has spent a year and a half establishing the right to hold something fully. Their son was born in November of 1884, which brought Naomi full circle to the month in which Harlan had written his very first unsent letter, though she did not make this observation until afterward, and when she did make it, Harlan smiled in the slow way he had and said, "I had noticed." They named him Robert James Bailey, Robert for Naomi's father and James for a kindness, because Harlan had told her once that his father, for all his failures, had a brother named James who had been the single steady adult presence in Harlan's childhood, and she had thought Robert James was the right combination of the people they carried forward. Robert was a healthy and demanding baby who announced his presence in every room he entered. Naomi had expected to love her child, but the particular quality of it surprised her, the sheer animal immediacy of it, the way she would watch him from across the room just to look at him, the way Harlan would come in from the day's work and pick him up, and the expression on Harlan's face in those moments was one Naomi kept quietly in herself like something precious, a private wealth. Harlan was, as she had perhaps always known he would be, a remarkable father. He was patient in the way that men are patient who have had to learn to sit with difficult feelings and not be ruled by them. He was physically present in the way that fathers sometimes are not, carrying Robert on his shoulder when the boy was fussing, talking to him about the horses and the land, and the weather with the same calm seriousness he brought to everything, as though the infant fully comprehended the conversation, which perhaps he did in some pre-language way. Naomi would sometimes stand in the doorway of whatever room they were in and watch them and feel something so complete that she could not always find the architecture of language for it. The letters stayed in the cedar box. Cecil Marsh died in the spring of 1885, peacefully and at a reasonable age, and half of Clover Creek came to the funeral. Naomi held Harlan's arm in the churchyard and thought about the morning Cecil had brought the saddlebag to her door, holding it out with both hands. She had not fully thanked him for that, not in words, and now she could not. And so she thanked him in the way you can still thank people who are gone, by acknowledging privately that what they did mattered. Gil Marsh, who had inherited his uncle's small property and dry goods business, came to see them a few weeks after the funeral, riding out to the ranch on a Sunday. He was 25 now and slightly more composed than the eager 22-year-old who had ridden to redemption and back with cheerful irrelevance, and he sat on their porch and drank coffee and played with Robert, who had just begun to walk and was conducting a thorough investigation of every surface within reach. Naomi watched Gil with the affection she had for people who had been present at important moments of her life, and when he was leaving she said, "I am grateful for redemption," and he knew what she meant. He grinned. "I figured it was something good," he said. "The way you talked about it, that wasn't a woman going to sort out a practical matter." "No," she agreed. "Was not." In the fall of 1885, there was a situation with the Territory Land Office that required Harlan to travel to Santa Fe for a week to address a recording error in the deed on their 80 acres. It was a bureaucratic inconvenience of the kind that the territorial land system routinely produced. The records kept in those years were imperfect, and disputes arose regularly. And the ride to Santa Fe was 2.5 days, which meant Harlan would be gone nearly 2 weeks in total. It was the first time they had been apart since redemption. The night before he rode out, after Robert was asleep in his small bed in the room they had built as an addition to the east side of the house, Harlan sat at the kitchen table with paper and a pen and wrote. Naomi watched him from the doorway for a moment, thinking of the letters in the cedar box, and then she said, "Are you writing me a letter?" He looked up. "Yes," he said simply. "You are leaving tomorrow morning," she said. "You could just tell me." "I know," he said, "but you kept the other ones. I thought you might like to have one that was actually meant for you." She crossed the kitchen and sat down across the table from him, and he read her what he had written in his careful and slightly formal voice, and it was not particularly long, a page, maybe a little more, but it was true in the way all the letters had been true, the same Harlan who had been honest in the dark now being honest in the light, telling her that the 80 acres and the house and Robert and the porch and the evenings watching the mesa and all the ordinary machinery of their life together was everything he had hoped for when he had not quite allowed himself to hope for anything. That he loved her in a way that was no longer frightening because it was simply the ground he stood on. That she had been right in the livery stable when she had said that worthiness is something worked out together over time, because he understood now what she meant, that it was not a thing you arrived at and held, but a practice, a daily attention, and he intended to keep practicing. When he finished reading, she sat with it for a moment, and then she said, "I will put it in the cedar box." "With the others?" he asked. "With the others," she said. He folded it and gave it to her across the table, and she held it. Outside, the night was deep and cold, and the stars over New Mexico were the extraordinary quantity of stars that you only see at that altitude and that distance from electric light, which would not reach Clover Creek for many years yet. And inside the kitchen the lamp was warm and Robert was asleep, and Harlan was going to Santa Fe tomorrow, and coming home in 2 weeks. And Naomi Graves Bailey thought about the distance from the kitchen table where the saddlebag had waited, 3 days unopened, to this kitchen table where she was receiving a letter written to be read. And the distance was not quite 3 years, but it contained more life than any previous decade. Harlan went to Santa Fe, and the deed was sorted, and he came home. He brought Robert a small painted wooden horse from a craftsman in Santa Fe, very well made, and Robert was solemnly captivated by it. He brought Naomi a book that she had mentioned once, months ago, half in passing, a volume of natural history that she had read about and expressed interest in without expecting anything to come of the mention. And the fact that he had remembered it and located it in Santa Fe was so characteristic of him that she felt it in the way she felt all the characteristic things, as a kind of ongoing confirmation that the man she had ridden 2 days to find in the desert was precisely the man she had suspected he was. She read the book over the following weeks, in the evenings on the porch or by the lamp at the kitchen table, and sometimes she read passages aloud to Harlan, who would be reading his own book or working on the ranch accounts, and he would listen with one ear and occasionally comment. And this felt like the most domestic and intimate thing she had ever done, reading aloud in a lit room to a man who was paying sufficient attention to hear it. By 1886, the ranch had found its rhythm. The drought of 1883 had been the worst of it, and the subsequent years had been kinder, and they had built the herd to a size that was beginning to be genuinely profitable, not wealthy. This was not a story about becoming wealthy, but the kind of comfortably sustainable that allowed them to put something aside for Robert's future, and to make the house a proper home rather than a work in progress. They built a second bedroom in the fall of 1886, because Naomi was expecting again, which she announced to Harlan with the same careful-made certainty of the first time, on the porch in the evening. He received it the same way, with the impact and the settling, and then he laughed, which was different from the first time, looser and more immediately joyful, because the first-time joy had been accompanied by the slight awe of the entirely new thing, and this time it was accompanied by the knowledge of what it actually was. "Robert will be an older brother," Harlan said, with a tone of considering this information from Robert's perspective. "He will not know what has happened to him," Naomi said. "He is extremely resilient," Harlan said confidently. "He has his mother's temperament. He has your stubbornness," she said, "which is convenient since stubbornness is occasionally useful." "On Tuesdays," Harlan said, meaning Dunsmore and the land negotiation which had become a private reference point for them, and she grinned. "The second child was born in the spring of 1887, a daughter this time, and they named her Clara. She was quieter than Robert from the very beginning, a still and observant baby who would lie in Naomi's arms and look around with a grave and wondering attention that made Harlan say, she was going to be the most serious person in Clover Creek, which turned out to be largely accurate. Robert, who was 2.5 and had some early doubts about the entire enterprise of a sibling, came around to Clara within the first week, in the way that children come around when they discover that a small person who thinks you hung the moon is actually quite agreeable to have. Life with 2 children was, as Naomi had anticipated and Harlan had cheerfully underestimated, considerably more demanding than life with 1. There were the ordinary logistical complications, and there was less time on the porch in the evenings, and there were stretches of weeks where Naomi was so thoroughly tired by nightfall that meaningful conversation gave way to mutual silence that was still the good silence, but was also partly the silence of exhaustion. She told him once on one of the harder weeks that she was sorry she was not better company at the end of the day, and he looked at her with a kind of mild exasperation, not at her but at the notion, and he said, "Naomi, you are doing 3 times the work of anyone I know. Stop apologizing for being tired. I do not want you to feel," she started, "lonely." He said, which was what she was going to say, "I am sitting in our house with our children asleep in the next room. I am the opposite of lonely. I am the most unlonely I have ever been in my life." She put her head on his shoulder, which was an argument-tending gesture she had developed somewhere in the past 3 years, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there in the lamplight and were quiet, and it was the good quiet. Robert grew into a sturdy and curious child, who showed every sign of having both his mother's practical intelligence and his father's capacity for patient attention, which combination made him an excellent observer of the natural world and a thorough reader by the time he was 6. Clara grew into precisely the serious and wondering person that Harlan had predicted, with a particular talent for drawing that Naomi noticed when she was 3 and encouraged with paper and charcoal sticks, and that by the time Clara was 5 had produced a series of detailed portraits of the horses and the dog they had by then acquired, and various members of the Clover Creek population that were genuinely impressive. Harlan kept writing the letters. Not the unsent kind, he had retired those, Naomi thought, permanently and without regret, but the kind he had promised, the ones left on the kitchen table. It was not a frequent practice, maybe once every few weeks, sometimes less, and she did not know always what prompted it. Sometimes it was after a particular day that had been difficult, sometimes after a good one, sometimes for reasons he did not explain and she did not require. She would find them in the morning when she came to make coffee, folded once and with her name on the front, and she would read them over coffee before the children were up, and then she would put them in the cedar box. The cedar box became full. In the fall of 1888, she bought a second cedar box from the new furniture maker in town, a craftsman who had come with his family from Missouri, and she put the overflow into that one. When Harlan saw it, he said simply, "Oh," in a tone that said he had not considered the arithmetic of it. "You are prolific," she said. "You keep all of them," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite surprise but was in the neighborhood. "Every single one," she said. "They are mine. You address them to me." He pulled her in and kissed her with the directness that had replaced, over the years, the careful and tentative quality of the early days, the full confidence of a man who knows exactly where he stands and where he is welcome. She kissed him back with the same confidence. Robert walked in, took one look, said, "I will come back," and walked back out, which both his parents found extremely reasonable. In 1889, New Mexico Territory was still some years from statehood, still the complicated, beautiful, contested country it had been throughout the decade, and the world was changing in ways that were reaching even into places like Clover Creek, more people moving west as the rails pushed further, the cattle industry stabilizing into something more organized and less wild, the particular frontier energy beginning to shade into something more settled. There were more people in town. There was talk of a proper school. There was a second mercantile and a doctor who had come from the east and stayed, and the Reverend had a proper church building now with real glass windows. Harlan and Naomi watched the changes with the perspective of people who had arrived in the territory early enough to have known it differently, but who were not romantic about it. The frontier had been beautiful and it had also been indifferent, and the indifference had cost people. Not them, mostly, though they had had their difficult stretches, but people they knew, families that had not made it, seasons that had been catastrophic. More doctors and schools and glass windows were not something to mourn. They talked about this on the porch one fall evening, the particular evening being remarkable because Robert was doing his lessons inside by the lamp, and Clara was asleep and Harlan and Naomi were alone on the porch, in a way they were less often alone now. And the mesa was the colors it was in autumn, and the air was the cold, clear air of October in New Mexico. And Naomi thought about October of 1882 with the kind of rich awareness that is only possible when you are looking back from a very good place. 7 years, she said. Harlan looked at her. From the first letter you wrote to now, she said. November 1881 to now is almost exactly 7 years. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the mesa. "I was an idiot," he said, "about the letters." "You were afraid," she said. "There is a difference." I wasted a year. You did not waste it, she said. You spent it becoming honest with yourself, which took you where you needed to go. The letters were not a failure, Harlan. They were you learning to say the thing. You just learned it on paper first. He looked at her with the full and steady attention that had been one of the first things she noticed about him, the quality of his listening, how he actually heard what you said. I am glad you found them, he said. I am glad you left them, she said. I did not mean to leave them. Some part of you did, she said, as she had said before in the livery stable in the beginning. He smiled. You have maintained that position for 7 years. It has held up under scrutiny, she said. He reached over and tucked the strand of hair that had come loose on the left side behind her ear. And she let him, because that was a gesture that never lost its significance, tied as it was to a letter written in November of 1881 about a man standing by a creek bank and talking about drainage patterns for 11 minutes and noticing a strand of hair and finding it the most distracting thing in the world. I love you, he said, as simply and directly as he had said it in the livery stable in Redemption, because some things do not need to become more complicated with time. I love you, she said back, because she had been saying it for 7 years in all the ways there were to say it, in the cedar boxes filling up with letters, in the evenings on the porch, in the kitchen and the garden and the quiet mornings and the difficult nights and the ordinary Tuesday afternoons of a life that was, by any measure she knew how to apply, as full and real as a life could be. By 1890, Clover Creek had changed enough that the Clover Creek she had arrived in 11 years ago was almost unrecognizable in physical terms, though the essential character of the place, the particular combination of people and landscape, the size of the sky, the red rock beyond the edge of town, was the same. Robert was 6 now and attending the new school in town, riding in with Harlan on the mornings. Harlan had business at the feed store or the farrier, and sitting at his desk with the same gravity he brought to everything, apparently one of the better readers in the class, which Naomi was privately pleased about. Clara was 3 and had recently discovered that she had opinions about most things and was not shy about expressing them, which Naomi found both exhausting and deeply recognizable. There was a 3rd child on the way. Naomi told Harlan in the winter of 1890, on a particularly cold evening when they had moved the porch conversations inside by necessity, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with coffee between them. He took it in, the familiar sequence on his face impact, settling, opening, and then he said, "We are going to need a larger table." "Possibly," she said. "Definitely," he said, and he was smiling. "You are not worried?" She asked because this was a practical consideration. 3 children on an 80-acre cattle operation, with the territory still in some degree of flux, was not a small matter. "I am not worried," he said, with the ease of a man who had learned to distinguish between the things worth fearing and the things that were simply the generous demands of a life going well. "We have managed everything else." "We have," she agreed. "Besides," he said, "I like our children. They are interesting. I want to see what this one does." She laughed and he grinned, and the lamp was warm between them, and outside the New Mexico winter was doing what it did, cold and enormous and indifferent, and inside the house on the 80 acres with the creek through the north end, it was the opposite of all of that. Their 3rd child was born in the fall of 1890, a 2nd son, and they named him Thomas. Harlan cried when they named him, quietly, looking at the baby in Naomi's arms, and she let him. And later he said, "I think Thomas would have liked you," meaning his brother, and she said, "I think so too," because the person he had been in the letters was someone his brother would have been lucky to know. Thomas was cheerful in a way that was almost aggressive, a baby who seemed constitutionally committed to finding everything amusing, which was a welcome addition to a household that already contained Robert's gravity and Clara's opinions. Naomi thought, watching the 3 of them in the kitchen one morning, Robert at his book, Clara drawing horses with charcoal, Thomas attempting to put a wooden spoon into a tin cup with the focused enthusiasm of someone solving an important problem, that this was what the letter of November 1881 had been feeling its way toward. This specific morning. This light on this table, and these three specific people who were here because their father had written letters he never sent, and because their mother had found them in a saddlebag on a fence post, and had the good sense to ride 2 days to say something about it. She got the cedar box out that morning, after the children were settled and Harlan was out with the horses, and she opened it and took out the very first letter, dated November 14, 1881. She read it through, not for the first time but for a specific time, and when she got to the end, a man with perfectly adequate command of the English language completely loses it when standing inside 20 feet of one woman in the whole of New Mexico territory. She folded it carefully and put it back. Then she took out a sheet of her own paper and a pen, and she wrote. She had not written many letters in her life, had not had the practice that Harlan had developed over his solitary year of writing, and the effort of it made her conscious of every word in a way that was uncomfortable and clarifying. She wrote to no one in particular, or rather to the accumulation of everything, to the idea of recording what a thing was when you were inside it, and before the details went soft with time. She wrote, "The saddlebag is on the shelf above the fireplace now. Harlan put it there when we moved in, said it deserved a proper place, and I agreed. It is not polished or preserved. It is what it is, worn leather with the buckle that was stiff that first night I opened it, and it sits there above the fire, and the children have grown up knowing it is there without knowing exactly why, only that it matters to their parents in a way that some things simply do. Robert asked me once what was in it, and I said, not much, which is technically true because I took everything out of it long ago. But it holds something anyway. Things do not only hold what is inside them." She continued, "I am 34 years old and I am in love with a man who spent a year writing letters he never sent because he was afraid I would be kind in declining them, and I think about that sometimes. What I would have said if he had knocked on the door in July of 1882 when he had decided to. I think I would have said something very practical because I was not yet ready to be otherwise, and perhaps I would have said something true because I was never comfortable being dishonest even in my own silences. I do not know if I would have said the right thing. I am glad we did not have to find out. I am glad for the year of letters and for the saddlebag on the fence post and for the 2-day ride to redemption, because all of that is ours, in a way that a knocked-upon door and a practical conversation would not have been. We came to each other by an unusual route, and I would not change a single step of it." She paused. Thomas had put the spoon into the cup and was now taking it out again with the same concentrated energy, and Clara had moved from horses to drawing the window, which she was attempting with her tongue between her teeth and her small hand moving in careful arcs, and Robert had finished his chapter and had moved to looking out at the yard with the alert, distant look of a child thinking through something. They were so completely themselves, all three of them, so entirely the people they were going to be. She wrote one more line. In the letters, Harlan wondered often whether he was worthy. I want to say for the record, though no record is required, that he is. That he has been, in all the ways that matter, in the daily and the difficult and the ordinary and the extraordinary, in the way he tucks the loose strand of hair behind my ear without thinking, in the way he holds our children, in the cedar boxes filling up with letters, in everything. The answer to the question he was afraid to ask is yes. It was always going to be yes. The yes was there in the space between us from the moment he stood by that creek bank talking about drainage patterns for 11 minutes, and I am glad, I am so deeply glad that we found our way to saying it out loud. She set down the pen. Outside, Harlan was crossing the yard from the paddock toward the house, his coat up against the late autumn cold, his hat brim low, His walk, the unhurried and certain walk she had been watching for almost a decade in various lights and seasons. He paused at the porch step to shake something from his boot, and then he looked up and through the window and saw her at the table, and his face did the thing it still did, that small and involuntary opening, and he raised one hand in a simple acknowledgement, just a lift of the hand. "I see you, I am here." She raised her hand back. He came inside, stamping cold off his boots and pulling off his gloves, and Thomas immediately abandoned the spoon and the cup, and toddled toward him with the whole-body enthusiasm of a 1-year-old greeting his father. And Harlan scooped him up and settled him on his hip with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing this for 6 years across 2 children and was now doing it for a third, and he said to Naomi, "Writing something." "Just a letter," she said. He looked at the paper with the warm curiosity that was so like him, the way he paid attention to what she was doing as a matter of genuine interest, not surveillance. "To whom?" She folded the paper and set it on the table. "No one in particular, to the record." He considered this, settling Thomas more securely on his hip and looking at her with the full and steady attention. "May I read it?" "Later," she said. "Tonight on the porch if it is not too cold." "I will build the fire up," he said. That evening, after Robert and Clara were doing their evening preparations, and Thomas was asleep in his small bed, they sat on the porch in their coats with the fire in the iron outdoor brazier that Harlan had built 2 winters ago for exactly this purpose, to extend the porch season into the colder months. And she gave him the letter, and he read it by the firelight, and she watched his face while he read. When he finished, he held the paper for a long moment without speaking, looking at the fire, and she let him have the silence because she had learned exactly when he needed it and when he did not, which was one of the things that 8 years of being in close proximity to a person will teach you. Then he said, "I should have knocked on the door." "No," she said, "you should not have." He looked at her. "If you had knocked on the door," she said, "we would have had a different beginning, and this beginning is ours. All of it, the letters, the saddlebag, redemption, the livery stable, Gil Marsh riding beside me in October like it was any ordinary errand. I do not want a different beginning. I want this one." He handed the letter back to her. "Put it in the box," he said. "It needs a box of its own," she said. "I wrote mine, you have filled 2. He laughed then, the real laugh, the full one. And it went out across the dark yard and the cold air and the mesa beyond, still and enormous and beautiful in the way that New Mexico in the fall is beautiful. And somewhere in the house Robert was laughing too at something entirely unrelated, and Clara's voice was going over something with her characteristic precision, and Thomas was asleep and dreaming. And the fire in the brazier was warm, and the stars were out in the extraordinary quantity they always were at this altitude and latitude, the whole sky dense with them. And Harlan Bailey took his wife's hand in both of his, and they sat together on the porch of the house they had built on the 80 acres with the creek through the north end, and the saddlebag was on the shelf above the fireplace, empty now of letters and full of everything else, and the cedar boxes were inside waiting for whatever came next, and nothing was unresolved, nothing was incomplete, nothing was waiting to be said. The year of unsent letters had become a life fully lived, spoken aloud, and very much meant. And on the mesa above Clover Creek, in the last of the firelight, the sky held all of them the way sky does, the living and the gone, the Thomas who had been 9 years old in the fever that took him, and the Robert Graves who had mapped the territory with patient precision, and the strand of hair and the creek bank and the 11 minutes of drainage patterns, and the saddlebag on the fence post in the dark before dawn, and redemption in October, and the livery stable and the yes that had always been there, waiting, all of it held in the enormous and indifferent and somehow also deeply generous dark. And Naomi and Harlan sat in the warm circle of the fire and were, in every sense that mattered, exactly where they were supposed to be.